Okay, Paul, I think we'll kick off.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on how to avoid being sued for £2 million. Today's webinar is being hosted by Paul Addison of DevAssist. And what Paul will cover today is just to make you aware of any possible development risks and opportunities when buying or selling a property. What we're trying to do today is educate you guys about location risk, the current planning system, and why location assessments are so important. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul. Hopefully you can all see the presentation on the screen. Before I hand over to Paul, I will just point out that if you've got questions as we go through, within your webinar program or Zoom, you'll notice that there are a Q&A button and a chat button. If you've got questions, just put them in there, and then what we'll probably do is save them until the end of the webinar to actually go through, and I'll pose those questions to Paul to answer them. If we don't get through everything, then what we'll do is we'll pick those up separately and answer them and come back to you directly. Okay, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I want to go through planning, development risk, but before I do that, what I want to do is give you my history because it is very relevant to the creation of DevAssist and why I built this business. If I go back to my days after education had enough of me, my first job was working for Crest Homes. I managed to get a role with them as a trainee land buyer. It was a job I loved, and I did it for 30 years. I worked my way up through Crest. I then moved over to Charles Church, and we became part of Persimmon, where I ended up as the Director of Land and Planning. I then went on to run another company. So my real background is actually not in the sort of search and report industry. It's actually in development. But the reason I created DevAssist was based upon my experience with people that look like this. Every time I submitted a planning application on one of my sites, I provoked huge hostility from the locals. And I've had hate campaigns, I've been spat at, sworn at, physical violence. There's a lady who actually works for Lend-Lease who's recently had death threats. So when we refer to the public as NIMBYs, or which are the not in my backyards, they're now known as the bananas, which is the build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. It really sort of makes them out to be a bit moany, a bit whingy, exercising their democratic rights, but it really doesn't touch on what they're really like, which is incredibly aggressive and hateful of any developers. So my epiphany was literally 3 o'clock in the morning, which was, why is the British public so ignorant about these risks? I know where they are. I know how to identify what can or is likely to get planning. So can we not create a product that can educate people about locations? It is probably the corniest phrase in property, but location. It is the most fundamental contributing factor to the value of a property, and yet it's the one thing that we never really investigate. We look inside that red edging, we never look outside it, and that's exactly what we do. We look outside. So we did some market research before we set this up, and we found that 95% of a solicitor's client base is concerned about the development. Interestingly, the Institute of Economic Affairs also did a study, and they got exactly the same statistics. So that told us straight away that there was a gap in the market for a report that can educate people about development risks. So we went and had a look and saw what was out there, and there were really two fundamental reports for residential conveyancing. There are some variations in commercial, but all we found was Landmarks Plan Search Plus and Groundshaw Planning, which are data scrapes. They never touch human hands. They're very clever and they're brilliant reports. Don't get me wrong, they're actually included in the cost of our report. Big difference being we go through them rather than leaving you as the solicitor to go through them or hand them over to your clients. So that's what we wanted to do. That's what we wanted to create, was an assessment of risk. But the bad news now for the public is the National Planning Policy Framework. This has been such a game changer. It was updated in 2019. In my 30 years in development, I have never seen such a shift in power in favour of the developer as opposed to perhaps the locals. It basically starts with an immediate presumption in favour of development. The relevance of that is if I go back to my development days, I remember I was promoting a site just south of Croydon, went to see the planning officer, and she started the meeting with, don't know why we're having this meeting, over my dead body, will you ever get planning on this site? No dead bodies involved, but we did get planning on that site. We won the appeal, much to the disgust of all the locals. But that was the culture that existed and to some extent still does exist. But what the central government is telling local government is stop saying no. You're going to start now with a position of, yes, you can have this. And then through the application audit, see if that decision should be reversed. There's a second element to this National Planning Policy Framework and sometimes little understood, and it's the 5-year housing supply. All local authorities in the country are tasked with having a 5-year housing supply. And what they'll do is effectively they'll start with a housing needs survey. That housing needs survey will assess what the council needs to provide over the next 5, 10, 15, 20-year period. So they really are planning for the future. So the housing needs survey, for argument's sake, may say over the next 5 years, we need to find 5,000 homes to be built, and they've got to be built in that 5-year period. If they're going to be in the 6th year, they can't count them. It's a very strict calculation. So what does the council do? Well, the first thing they're going to do is look at their unimplemented planning consents, and they'll add them up. So if we pretend council needs to find 5,000 plots, units, homes, flats, mixture, they'll start with those unimplemented. So let's pretend they found 1,000. Then they're going to look at their allocated sites, sites that are definitely going to be coming forward over that 5-year, and they may find another 3,000. So, okay, we're now at 4,000. What do they do with the missing 1,000? Because the impact of not having a 5-year supply changes how that local authority can determine planning applications. In a situation where a local authority has an undersupply, there is an automatic presumption in favour of development, and that doesn't avoid areas of national parks, greenbelt, areas of outstanding natural beauty. If I come along as a developer in a council that doesn't have a 5-year supply, propose an application on a green field, which perhaps could be in an AONB, the presumption is in favour of development. And this is why we are seeing more greenfield development than I have ever seen in my career. And weirdly, I don't like it, because in spite of my pro-development background, we're starting to see very, what I would see, bad decisions. We're seeing the erosion of some areas of the countryside purely because that local authority has failed to create that supply chain. There's a staggering amount of councils that don't have this supply chain. If you look to the right of this screen, everything there that I've highlighted are councils who are under the 5 years or right on the cusp, and very, very vulnerable. And I hate to point out the obvious, but with this dreadful pandemic that we're experiencing, we are going to see a massive reduction in houses coming forward because all developers have hit the brakes. And that will create that undersupply. And as we come out of this, that will open up more areas for development. This is recently, I found this from Savills, and if you can see here, everything really sort of coloured in the dark colours. These are councils that do have a 5-year supply, but I know that there's an awful lot there. In particular, Cornwall, which is, it's on the cusp. Cornwall has fell in and out of having a 5-year supply. So there's a huge tract of the land. Wherever your clients could be buying a property, there's probably a 50-50 chance that they're buying in an area or council that doesn't have that 5-year supply. So let's go back to my mythical 5,000 plots. Council needs to find 5,000, found 1,000 with planning consents, find 3,000 that were in allocated sites. The way they find the missing 1,000 is with a strategic housing land availability assessment. There's different variations of this. There you can have Sheilas, you can have LARs, they're all pretty much the same thing. But what they seek to do is identify sites and locations with potential for development, assess the development potential of them, and assess their suitability and likelihood of the development coming forward. So it starts basically with a call for sites. Basically what the council will do is they will write to everybody on their database. So it could be the national top 10, top 20 house builders. It could be local house builders, farmers, large employers, local solicitors, estate agents, surveyors, etc. Anybody on their database. And that letter will basically invite anybody with land that they feel is available for development to throw their hat in the ring. Needless to say, loads of people throw their hat in the ring. And then it will go through the SHLA assessment. And what pops out the other end is land that the council has considered suitable and deliverable for housing. They are high-risk sites, and yet you will not find them in planning data because there's no planning history. Planning data, such as Plan Search Plus and Ground Shore Planning, are only as good as the activity of an applicant. If no one's ever submitted an application for development, then it won't come up. And I will give you some examples very shortly of where that is relevant. Now, this is a case study of a property in Windsor. The property fell into Windsor and Maidenhead Council, but the front garden, and the reason it was in Windsor and Maidenhead Council was because the front door fell within Windsor and Maidenhead, but the front garden was actually in Bracknell. So it was split between effectively two councils. So we had to, in this particular case, this is one of our premium reports. It was a large property, grade 2 listed mansion with beautiful rural views, very rural location and lovely views to the south over open land. But we had to look at both of the 5-year supplies for these areas and found that Bracknell only had about a 2.5-year supply. So any land is up for grabs in that area. It then turned out that when we investigated the SHLA, the land to the south had been identified as suitable and deliverable for housing for 2,200 homes. No planning history there. So you could not find out this information unless you investigated the SHLA. I'm very proud to say, when it comes to investigating SHLAs, you actually have two choices at the moment. One is to do them yourselves or employ us. We are the only company in the country that does what we do. So we've completely monopolized this massive gap in the market. So this is a high-risk site. This is a high-value property, perhaps a very litigious client who could be buying a property and who's going to be pretty miffed when they see 2,000 homes built right in front of them. This is actually in Tandridge District Council, just south of Croydon. It's an area I know well. I was actually born in this town. And as you can see from the image here, it's a park. It's a beautifully flat park, ready for kickabouts with balls. You can see there's a fully equipped play area. And as you can see to the left, it's called a recreation ground. But if you look at achievable, it says development of this site is considered to be achievable. Status, deliverable, can be developed within 5 years. This is a park, and this is the desperation that councils are seeing, is that they are considering all land as suitable for development. Now, this one hasn't gone the distance yet. There is always, for the purpose of clarity and honesty, I must state that just because something is found suitable and deliverable and is in the SHLA, it doesn't mean it will go the distance, but all the warning signs are there. It's been found suitable by the council, it's been found deliverable, and clearly you've got a willing landowner who's prepared to donate well, not donate, but sell their land for development. This is one that has gone the distance. This is actually in Wokingham. This was a report we were doing, our DevAssist report. It's only a £80 report. That includes the cost of planning data. So it's only about a £50 extra over and above Plan Search Plus or Ground Shore Planning, but with the huge weight of investigations that we carried out by real people, not computers. We do real investigations. But what we had here on this Edwardian cottage was a park to the northwest. But on investigation, we found in emerging policy that the council had identified their park as a potential location for change. They were going to build houses on the northern and western boundary. Very detailed drawings had already been submitted by Berkeley Homes. And right down in the southeast boundary, which was the bit directly opposite where the client was looking to buy, was a nice shiny Asda. And that was there, you know, clearly a massive impact on that property. We would have actually commented on the front cover of our report that that is a potential lending risk, because what we want is really the valuer to have the last word. The valuer must now take account this very significant change of view and reflect that in the valuation, which I suspect they wouldn't have found this out. In fact, I can almost guarantee they wouldn't have found it out, because when they drove past that car, the house at 60 miles an hour doing their valuation, they didn't do any more investigations other than check the existence of the property. So this is why, if you look at local policy and existing policy, it doesn't give you the whole picture. This is in Mole Valley District Council in Surrey. Again, one of our entry-level DevAssist reports, very powerful report. You can see there that we've site-centered the property, marked it with the red pin, drop a 75-meter radius over it, and then what we do is we study that area, that whole location, in three ways. We look to the past, the present, and the future. We're looking at the past to see where is there a precedent that's been established locally. The present, is there live planning activity? It could be that the neighbours have just applied for a planning application for a two-storey extension. Very relevant if that's going to create shadowing over your property. So we also include householder extensions, but only on abutting properties. I must make that clear. It would be too difficult to cover every extension that was being proposed. We basically do those that matter, the ones next door. And then we look to the future. What land that doesn't have any planning history, but shows all of those signs, those signals that myself as a nasty land buyer would get me excited and see that I can see a potential development site here. So in this case, if you see on the left here, the property is right on the settlement boundary. Everything to the left is greenbelt. So if you went to Mole Valley Council, went to their local plan, you would see that land is greenbelt. You'd check what greenbelt policy is, and greenbelt policy would clearly tell you there is a strong presumption against any form of development. But you still go to the same council's website, but now you go looking for their SHLA, and you find out that this land has already been identified in the SHLA, found to be suitable, found to be deliverable. It's now a high-risk site. That lovely view over open land is at risk of change, and something that clearly your clients would want to know about. 5-year supplies, these are worth looking at. In our premium reports, we look at the 5-year supply of that council and we actually research it. So here was in West Sussex, what we had was a lovely barn. We checked it on, I think it was Rightmove, and we found it was selling at about 1.5 million. And it had countryside effectively on all 4 boundaries. But on its northern and eastern boundary, it abutted a large field which had planning history for the site that you can see in the centre there. So a very, very significant impact on that property. But that application was refused by the council and it went off to appeal, and the inspector also dismissed the appeal. So this is when locals are always popping the champagne, thinking they've beaten that nasty developer. But you've got to read that appeal decision. And in that appeal decision, it was determined that the council did have an adequate 5-year supply, so there was no need to release greenfield land for development. But when you actually looked at the council's supply, it was at 5.2 years. That's right on the cusp, and you go through any moment where you could have, you know, perhaps where we had really up to Boris getting into power last year, we did see a slowing down of the market. And of course that reduces housing supply. COVID-19 is going to reduce housing supply. So all of these things will have an impact. And the reason this is relevant is we would have still highlighted that as a high-risk site. You've got a motivated landowner, you've got a motivated applicant, and the only reason why that was refused was because of the supply. No other matters. It wasn't highways, it wasn't design. So if the council fell under that 5-year supply, I bet you that developer is racing back in there with a new application, and the council will have no choice but to approve it, because the only matter to be considered is supply. This is a real schlar. This is Oxford City. The reason I picked on Oxford City is it's one of the clearest we found. It's one of the easiest to find. Sometimes when you go looking for schlars, that they can take you ages. We've created super quick links to them, which is why we can do these reports en masse relatively quickly. But sometimes you can waste half an hour trying to look for them because they're in the dungeons of their websites. But on the left, you've got areas coloured in pink. These are all landowners that have volunteered their land for consideration for development. And I should say one other thing about schlars. They're not just for housing. They are also, you have the SHELAs, which is the Strategic Housing and Economic Land Availability Assessments. So they're actually looking for not only housing land supply, employment land supply, they're also looking for sites for gypsies and travellers so that they can be provided for as well. But what popped out here was on the right-hand side, blue, unsuitable or not deliverable. It may have passed the suitability test, but because it wasn't deliverable, it was marked in blue. But yellow is suitable and deliverable, high-risk sites. And as you can start to look a little bit carefully at that, you can start to see that there's dozens and dozens of small pockets of yellow, which mean these are sites with no planning history. They won't come up in Plan Search Plus or ground shore planning, but they are going to be developed in the future. So why did we create this report? Well, when we look at poor conveyancers and the huge level of expertise, you have to be experts now in flooding, you have to be experts in environmental law, you have to be experts now in development, and perhaps even within that, maybe even do a little bit of law. One of our clients in London, I think he summed it up beautifully when he said, "I don't practice law anymore, I practice risk." And that is this, it's all about risk elimination. And we do know that poor old conveyancers, non-disclosure of matters allegedly affecting a property during the sales often provokes subsequent litigation. So we're just another way of really checking that location properly. So why did I call this presentation How to Avoid Being Sued for 2 Million? Well, it was based upon the case study of Bird & Bird. Bird & Bird were sued by their client on a negligence claim. It was successful and it was just shy of £2 million that their PI had to pay out to a Rebecca Chow. But I want to give you the whole story here so that you can form your own opinion. For what it's worth, my opinion is completely in support of Bird & Bird. They're a great firm who are doing nothing other than trying to do a very good and very thorough job. They are not bucket shop conveyancers trying to do the bare minimum. They want to do a proper due diligence, a risk elimination. So what they did was they had their client, Rebecca Chow. I think what was interesting here was that this is, as I see it, a commercial transaction. She was buying it through a BVI registered company, or Enfield Holdings. So as an investment purchase, there must be one only motivation. It's money. If it's investment, it's got to make money. It's got to be a good place to put your money. And she bought this property. Well, she agreed to buy this property. She employs Bird & Bird. Bird & Bird do a very thorough job. They get their hands on every possible search and report they could, one of which was Landmark's Plan Search Plus. The mistake that they made, which could have been very easily avoided, was that they understandably didn't want to just hand over that report to the client because the client may not understand it. So they interpreted that data themselves. They went through it, concluded there was nothing to worry about. I can understand why they did say that as well. Never even advanced and emailed on the PDF to the client. What they should have done was the simplest of things, was bounce on that Plan Search Plus to the client with a statement saying, this is outside our scope of works. Please read the attached report and tell us you are still happy to proceed. They could have avoided the whole issue by doing that. But that's not very fair, is it? Because you're actually asking someone who's not experienced in reading that report. The way I always sort of give the analogy I give with planning data is, imagine how you felt if you had gone to see your doctor and let's say you'd had a test on your heart, an ECG or something. How would you feel at the end of that consultation if the doctor turned around and said, oh, I've got your ECG here, I printed it off, could you take it home, have a read, tell me what you think? well, you'd be immediately questioning the doctor and say, well, I don't understand that. I want you to go through it. And that's what we do with the planning data. We go looking for those needles in the haystack. We pull out what's relevant. And if we find something that's relevant, we attach images as well. So it's a very visual report. It will have the site layout, the elevations, copy of a planning refusal, copy of a planning approval, an appeal, etc., or a withdrawal letter, because they're all relevant, because they all show intent from landowners. But anyway, back to this story. They advised the client, she went ahead, she exchanged contracts. Between exchange and completion, she then finds out that to the northwest, there is an existing school or college, and it was evolving into an academy. The impact of that was a change in student numbers of 700 to about 1,400. It was doubling, and she found that so unpalatable, she said, I'm not going to complete, because had I had known about that, I would not have exchanged contracts. And because it wasn't declared, and because Bird & Bird had said there was nothing to worry about, she obviously pursued them for that loss of deposit costs, etc. And as we know, successfully won. Now, from a valuing point of view, I can state categorically, after with my experience of 30 years valuing land, that impact will have no impact on the subject property. You could even argue it would enhance the property, because in some areas, better educational facilities is a draw to an area. It actually improves them. Certainly in Kent, where you've got the grammar system, loads of people will move there purely to get their kids into that grammar system. Where I get a little bit smug on this was this property had to be resold. And it was put back on the market. It was sold to Elizabeth Murdoch. Of interest, I think that it was sold at 28.5 million, £3.5 million more than Rebecca Chow had agreed to buy it for. Remember, it was an investment purchase. She could have made a very tidy profit if she'd have just honoured her contract. But, and my smug moment is, the solicitor that represented Elizabeth Murdoch ordered one of our reports. And as you can see on the right here, we marked it as a high risk, that the risk of development being undertaken was high. Are there major planning applications of concern? We said yes. Are any important views going to change? We said yes. Is the area under threat from development? Yes. Is there a risk to a lender? No. We absolutely nailed it, all because we went through that data basically with a fine-tooth comb, and we found what was relevant. Of interest was, though, that we also found 3 other sites, four other sites, 3 of which had live unimplemented planning permissions for new build, 2 of which were directly opposite the property. So stats, in 2018 and 2019, nearly a third, it was actually 29% in 2018, 31% in 2019. 31% of our reports identified 1 or more high risk development sites within that 75 meters that we were studying. So it's a phenomenally high hit rate, and I think that shows the change in attitude from central government. This obviously statistic changes at different parts of the country. So can you just rely on planning data? Well, this is why I want to show you that you can't. As you can see here, here's an extract here of a Landmarks Plan Search Plus. And it said that there were no applications of 10 to 50 dwellings within 250 meters, apart from the one we found right at the bottom of the garden, site 1, where there was planning there for, I think it was 100 plus homes, going to have a critical impact on that property's view. Certainly you'll refer back for the valuer. So yeah, we would have marked that high risk. Yes, 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 there is a risk to a lender. We've protected you. We are here to protect the buyers, the solicitors, and the lenders. To keep it fair, this is with Groundshaw, and because I don't want to pick on them, I'm not trying to say that these reports are bad, quite the opposite. They're a critical part of our investigation, but they only cover the active applications that have been made in that area. They don't cover the ones that don't come through or haven't yet had planning submitted. So here we had the Avista report from Groundshaw, which a great report, does all sorts. It looks at ground stability, environmental, HS2, and it also covers planning. But this came out with a pass. We went through the planning data. It said there were no large developments, no small developments, and only 3 householder extensions. But we found a rather large site identified in the SHLA, suitable and deliverable, critical impact to that view. Again, we would have had that as a refer to lender. It's not always about the development. This is my non-politically correct slide. This was, I think it was in Guildford, if I remember right, Guildford Council. But what we had behind this property, as you can see, we have sites 1, 2, 3, 4. That would have covered sort of maybe one-for-one replacements or householder extensions in the case of sites 2 and 4, because they are next door. But the interesting site here was site 5. We found in emerging policy that the council had identified the land at the rear of this property as suitable for a permanent camp for gypsies and travellers. Now, I'm not going to go into the wrongs and rights of this. I'm just going to state a valuing fact. And the valuating fact of this is, if that becomes a permanent camp for gypsies and travellers, the value of these properties in this area will plummet. The marketability of them will plummet. They may even not sell because the British public have decided, for whatever reason, they don't want to live next door to gypsies and travellers. As I say, I don't want to get into the wrongs and rights on that, but it is a fact, and I'm sure most people would accept that if they went back to their client and said, oh, by the way, there is a 50-50 chance of that becoming a gypsy site at the rear. Do you still want to proceed? Do you think people are going to do it on the toss of a coin? I don't think they are. I think they're running for the hills. And again, it's certainly a refer back to the valuer, because I'm sure the bank would want to have a view on that. If they did go ahead, they would get their driveways regularly tarmacked, so there would be a small upside. On the right, you can see same circumstances. It was just outside the 75 metres, but it was another one that was being site that had been land that had been identified for gypsies and travellers. I just show you that because we're not cruel enough to not mention things if they fall outside the 75 metres. We would rather score brownie points with you and impress you with the level of information. If we're aware of something, we would still write it into the report. And remember, we are real people writing these reports. Planning data, it's up to you. We don't express a preference. If you like Groundshaw as opposed to Landmark, you can use them. FCI, they've also released some planning data. So we've now got a newcomer to the market, which is good, because anything that shakes it up makes planning data better. I want to also have some other caveat here, because we can only be as good as the quality of the planning data in front of us. If for any reason Landmark, through their system of data capture, have failed to capture a planning application, we can't report on it. We have to assume that these reports are positive. In fairness, where we have had this, and it's incredibly rare, Landmark were actually fantastic at sort of putting their hand up and admitting that it was their fault. Now, it's not just residential, it can be commercial. Now, residential is clearly very emotive. People have fallen in love with a property, and all they want you to do as the conveyancer is to really, come on, just get off your backside and just get me in there because I'm so excited about this move. And you're just trying to sober them up and say, well, hang on, I've got to check this so that you've got a property you can resell. With commercial, you're really trying to look at the impact of the business. Is it going to fulfill everything that the directors of that business wanted it to? And here we had a case of somebody taking a restaurant, a lease on a property for a restaurant, high value area, West End of London, just up from Piccadilly Circus. What did we find? Well, we found site 1 and 2, which were massive new builds. The existing facade, because it was conservation area, was going to be retained, but behind that facade was going to be a massive development, mix of leisure uses, retail, some other restaurants, bars, and some employment as well. Great news for the restaurateur, because this is an awful lot of people, of activity in the area that will be walking past her restaurant and will look to come in. But what we found when we looked at the planning conditions for sites 1 and 2 was that there was a planning condition that said that the road was going to need to be closed during the major stage of the construction, purely for safety reasons. So now there's a 6-month period where we've got nobody walking past that restaurant. Can the directors of that company, can they cash flow that period where they're still paying rent, still paying rates, and they've got nobody coming in there? So it may just cause a renegotiation of perhaps where they were going to take possession of that property. So it's a different inflection that we put into those reports when they're for commercial properties. This again was a commercial property. It was a relatively small structure on a large site with an applicant that, you know, like we all do, have plans for growth with our businesses. So they had planned that they could actually extend that B1 light industrial unit. But what we found on the opposite side of the road was site 3, which was identified for 1,000 plus houses. Now, the reasons that's relevant is the ones that are going to be closest to that property are very likely to object to any expansion of commercial activity, because all the usual objections will come out, such as highways and all the roads can't cope, and the noise and perhaps the smells. So now it allows the directors of that firm to say, well, actually, when we do plan to expand, it might not be as simple as we originally thought. Let's take this into account so that they can make a very grown-up decision before they go ahead and contract on that acquisition. Incidentally, with the premium report, as you can see here, the premium report is not a 75-metre radius as the DevAssist report is. The DevAssist premium searches 75 metres from the boundaries of the property. The difference with the reports I will come on to later, but if you're risk averse, please go for a premium. Urban development, there's an 80% chance that there is undeveloped land within 75 metres of a property. Londoners, there's a 1 in 5 chance of you experiencing significant change. Manchester, 42%. That's the worst we found in the country. It's almost 1 in 2 reports will have a high-risk site. And I want to take you to one of my favourite case studies of where we did a report, one of our DevAssist reports, £80 plus VAT. What we found here, and the property in question, I think it was a first floor flat in Folkestone. It had views to the rear and views to the front. It was in a grade 2 listed structure. And as you can see, right in front of this property is the beach. The only thing that separates it is the road. Road, then beach, then sea. Lovely sea views. What could possibly go wrong? Well, even we were shocked on this. We did our report. We found out that firstly, the car park at the rear was identified in the SHLA, suitable, deliverable. So certainly views and development construction activity is coming. But more disturbing was the beach. We found that the beach had been actually granted planning permission. It was unimplemented for over 1,000 flats. So part of the beach was going to see a huge development. That the sea view is disappearing. It shocked me because I've never seen one like this. I've now seen loads. But I drove down there the next day because I wanted to see, is there any visible clue on site that could have told somebody this? And there wasn't. If I go back to this picture, this is the picture I took. I was looking for a planning notice attached to a lamppost. I was looking for a board that said site acquired by Taylor Wimpey. I was looking for a for sale, land acquired by anything. There was not one clue on site. You would not have found out about this unless you had actually gone through that planning data, gone and looked at the SHLA. So a real frightener there. Nothing is safe. Again, and I'll emphasize this here, this was in a relatively modern development. If you look to the picture at the bottom right, you can see these are very contemporary designed flats, views over the Thames estuary. And you can see they've all been bought with water views. So what could possibly go wrong with the water view? Well, that's the water view at the front. And if I just go back to here, you will see there is an application to effectively reclaim land, go into the water and create new land and build a multiple story development, which is going to block all those water views. So just because you're on the water's edge, it doesn't matter. When you get into higher value areas, it's amazing what developers and how creative they and their architects will be in trying to find areas for development. When we get into London, you're maybe looking for different types of risks. So we do actually have a city report. It's not just for London, it's for any sort of high value central area. It could be the centre of Reading, it could be the centre of Brighton, London, Birmingham, Manchester. I wouldn't recommend it for perhaps Plymouth or Norwich, where you don't have high value exits. But we're looking for different risks. And if you can see here on site 1 on the left, this is actually part of the overground railway system. I think it was Camden Way, I think, if I remember right. Why is it identified as a site? It's a live, active railway. Well, it's very easy. It's in a cutting. So you just slab across the top, build on top of the slab, turn it into a tunnel. You've now got a very high value development site. On the right, you'll see basements, and basements are critical. When you get into high value London, Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, etc., they are, and I hate to use this word at the moment, but there is an epidemic of basement proposals. And this is why they're so important. This is a house that was once owned by Duffy, the pop star. She'd actually just sold the property. The new owner got the contractors in, and they were building a basement. And that's what it looked like 5 seconds later. It literally fell into its own hole. Now, the question I want to pose to you is not, has your client just agreed to buy this property? I'm more thinking about, what about the attached terrace property, high value property? Your clients have just exchanged contracts to buy it. It's now at risk. It's an unsafe structure because it's the party wall is wobbled into this site. Is the bank going to advance monies on a structure that's been declared unsafe? It's just a legal nightmare. So this is why with our city report, and it is the most expensive report we do, it's a £500 report, but we manually check every single property, every relevant property that could impact that property. The reason we manually check them is when you buy planning data, it's out of date. In some cases, it can be 4 weeks out of date at the point of purchase. So by manually checking, we're looking for planning applications that may have been registered just in the last week. And we also update the report free of charge before exchange. It's really for those very litigious high value properties in big city locations. But we're looking for property modifications, not just new build developments. Anything that could be affecting it. Could be a basement, it could be a lightweight structure on a roof. We've had one in London where there was an existing 30-storey building, and there was permission granted for an additional 15 stories to be built on top of it, because with lightweight structures now, you can do this, and you can certainly do that in very high value areas. And this was a great case study not far from Eaton Square, prime London areas where Tony Blair's got a house. Terraced property, probably worth in the region 25 million at a guess, I would say. On both sides of the property, both party walls that property enjoyed, there were basements being proposed on both sides. And as you can see from the central picture there, the depth of the basements that were being proposed is considerably deeper than the original foundations that the property has. So it is vitally important, because you want to check the insurance of the property, the lender, etc. So I'm sure you kind of get the point there. Now, rural areas are not necessarily safe, although 60% of development will come from windfall development, sites that haven't been promoted through SCHLARS or through local policy. Because of this 5-year supply, we're now seeing immediate threats. So this was back in Cornwall, when they didn't have a 5-year supply of housing. The predatory developers, they identify this, they find a willing landowner, put in an application for 50 houses, in spite of the fact that it's in the middle of nowhere. This is a very rural location, but planning permission was granted. And I see it as a dreadful planning decision, because it's just urbanizing a field in the middle of nowhere. It's going to look so out of place. Equally, in terms of access to buses and schools, etc., it's not going to work. But Cornwall couldn't defend it because they didn't have that 5-year supply. This is one of my favourite ones, because this is, I hope, how you look at your practice as a business, because this is a true story of one of our clients in East Anglia. The client in particular told me after the event that he had offered his client 3 choices in the client care letter. Option A, please give me £80 plus VAT. I will commission a specialist report from a company called DevAssist who will do X, Y, Z. Option B, if you're too tight to give me £80 plus VAT, please give me 30 odd pounds and I'll get you planning data, but you will have to read it yourself. He obviously picked up on the Bird and Bird case. Option C, do nothing at all. His client, which he described as a little old lady, went for option B. She drew a line in the middle and she went for the planning data. He did the correct thing. He sent the planning data on to her and asked her to read it. She went ahead, exchanged, completed, and then finds out, as you can see here, before and after, that the lovely private open space that was in front of her property was in fact, had planning permission granted for a 3-storey education block, and that was going to be her new view. She was miffed. He very kindly sent me the letter. And this is what it reads. It says, I was shocked to receive a letter from Churchill College about planned development on the site opposite my new home. Discovered that a planning application was made on January the 14th. I checked the search about planning applications you supplied in March, copy enclosed, which made no mention of this. The consequences of this development, blah, 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 blah. And then she signs off what happens. Now, that is not a client who's going, in hindsight, I made the wrong decision. You were quite right. I should have gone for option A. They probably, as we all know, clients probably don't read client care letters. They just sign them, give them back to you, and they, please, can you just get me into this house because I'm all very excited. But I did ask him. I said, can you send me the same planning data that you provided her, because I want to do a retrospective report. And he did. And we did a retrospective report, and lo and behold, the planning application for the 3-storey education block, it was in the planning. It was landmarked, Plan Search Plus. It was in there. Now, why did she miss it? Probably she lost the will to live reading planning data because it can be incredibly boring. Or was it because it was geocoded to the wrong location? What you can see here is the red edging is the actual site where the proposal was for the education block, but it was geocoded to an XY point. All applications currently, and this is one of the failings of planning data, and it's not landmark or ground shorts force, it's how planning is captured at council level. They are geocoded to an XY point. So they had geocoded this to the headquarters of the college, which was 220 meters to the northwest. So it said in the planning data, application for 3-storey education block, 220 meters northwest. Easily missed and thought, well, I'm not worried if it's 200 meters away, but of course it wasn't. It was about 20 meters away to the northeast. And that's why when we read planning data on large expanses of land, we have to be very careful that we cover going even sometimes out to 700 meters, because we need to know, is there an application anywhere within that vast area of land? Now, from a business point of view, he's lost a client. She's not going to go around saying, oh, I wish I'd have taken my solicitor's advice. He was actually brilliant and told me what to do. No, she's still going to go and say bad things. He's lost a client. She's bad-mouthing his business to other people, in spite of the fact that he's an exceptional solicitor who had actually tried to walk his client into best advice. Needless to say, what does he now do? He makes his clients have these reports, and lots of solicitors now do that. They are mandated by them because they see the value in them. These are the reports. DevAssist, £80 plus VAT. I advise small residential, small commercial, and clients who really aren't bothered about risk. It takes 5 days for us to complete a DevAssist report, needless to say, a little bit quicker at the moment with the way business has gone. DevAssist Premium, larger resi, large commercial, or risk-averse clients, maybe a risk-averse solicitor, not just a client. Both of those reports, the cost of the planning data is included. DevAssist is quicker. It comes back in 3 days. It's a £250 report, but again, includes the planning data. If you're in a big city location, such as a Manchester or a London, I would advise on high value property, resi or commercial, please go for the Dev City. It does everything and more that the premium does. But if your client doesn't want to cough up £500, at least you can say, have a premium. And if they don't want to cough up for that, you can say, have a DevAssist. We do have another product on Dev Probate, but I'll worry about that another time. Fast track, we can also fast track these reports. If you do have a demanding client who's got to exchange by Friday and you need this report back immediately, it's a queue jumper. You pay extra for it, no doubt, but we'll get them back on the same day. Worst case, 24 hours. Only caveat is the council's website available? Sometimes they go down. So we've got lots of clients. So one of the wonderful quotes, which I didn't even ask for, it just came from Brendan, a barrister in Bristol. And he said, I suspect that your services will become a standard requirement for all solicitor conveyancing searches. I love him for saying it. It's not yet standard, but it certainly is best practice. And then Caroline, who's a great client of ours, Adams and Reamers in London. she uses, as she says, my team include a DevAssist report as a standard in every transaction we work on. The reports are invaluable for buyers, lenders, and solicitors, providing full information from the experts in respect of all development risks. The report is also a game-changing addition to assess development potential. It's something I didn't cover, actually. We do look at the potential of the asset that your clients are buying. It may well be it's got hidden value, and they could be in the future extracting substantial income from selling part of or all of it for development. So we look at that as well. We act for many private banks, and after hearing our testimonial and information provided by DevAssist, they now correctly insist that we include the reports as a standard requirement. This is essential for all property lawyers, bless her. So very grateful for her for saying that. You will be pleased to know that I am at the end. I want to thank InfoTrack. All of these reports are available through the lovely, lovely people at InfoTrack. For what it's worth, when I came up with the idea of creating this business, STL, which is now part of InfoTrack, I actually worked very closely with them. So I've been involved with this company literally from the beginning, where they helped me develop a product that was available and suitable for conveyancing. So I've always had a soft spot for them because of that. So, but I'm at my end. My email address is paul@devassist.co.uk. If you've got any individual points you want to cover, I can email you an e-brochure or contact the lovely people at InfoTrack, who will also have our e-brochure as well. But I'm going to go back to Adam and see if I'm going to be put on the spot with any questions. But thank you for listening.
You are. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, you are. Two questions, actually. First one, which I think you've kind of answered, actually, but would your reports identify sites at risk of general commercial development?
Yes.
And the second one, if you carry out a search which indicates that there are no large planning applications, and then it transpires your report would have shown an application, presumably, if you get sued, you can claim against the search provider.
That would be correct. I think that the touch wood, we never have been in that situation. We got close to it once where, as I said earlier, Landmark had failed to correctly record a planning application that was relevant, and they were very quick to put their hands up and say, do you want our insurers? But touch wood, we've never been sued, but we do carry the PI. So the simplest sell on our business is don't take the risk yourself like Bird and Bird did, swerve it to us. We've got the cover here in case we get it wrong.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's it. That's the only questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think we're good. So thank you very much for your time, Paul. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone else who's joined the webinar today. Hopefully everyone's staying safe and is doing well. Oh, sorry, actually, there's another question that's just come in, Paul, before we go.
Okay.
What about the seller's risk as to loss of land value?
Well, we do look, there is a company that actually looks to use our, because we do have other reports such as DevCheck and DevProbate. What they do is they look at an asset to see, does it have hidden value? So before it is sold, should the existing owner maximize that asset's value by using the planning system? So we can hold people's hand and go in. We're doing it actually on a field at the moment. We act for a large debt recovery firm who had a 5-acre field in the southeast. They thought it was worth about £40,000 for grazing. Within seconds of it being sent to us, we realized it actually had a value of about £3 or £4 million. Because it has huge potential for a promotion, for a settlement expansion. So we are now helping them release that value. So we can look at the asset before a client looks to sell it, but really in the main with DevAssist, DevAssist Premium and DevCity, we're looking to protect the buyer's solicitor and the buyer's lender from what they're going to buy. But it could be that we're identifying that what they're about to buy has hidden value. So it could be good news, not bad news.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Okay, that's all the questions. So thank you to everyone else who has joined the webinar today, and thank you to Paul for running it. I will now sign off and close down the webinar. Thank you, Paul, and we'll see you all later. Hope everyone's staying safe. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.